Imagine it's the year 2065. Do you picture a world more crowded than today, or one that's already starting to shrink? I always thought I knew the answer. For years, the definitive forecast, the one you see in every headline, came from the United Nations, and it pointed to a peak of over 10 billion people around 2083. It felt like a distant, almost abstract fact of the future, but what if that timeline is dangerously optimistic? What if the peak comes decades earlier, not with a gentle plateau, but with a sharp turn, and we are fundamentally unprepared for the economic and social earthquake that follows? This isn't just a debate for demographers. It's about pension crises, geopolitical shifts, and growth models that are about to hit a wall far sooner than anyone in power wants to admit. Before we dive into this analysis, please note that this video is an educational and analytical discussion of major demographic and geopolitical trends. It reflects my own analysis based on publicly available information from sources like the UN, peer-reviewed journals, and economic research. I am not offering financial, legal, or investment advice. The goal here is to understand a profound global shift, not to promote any ideology. Now let's get into it. For decades, the demographic narrative was one of relentless, if slowing, growth. The UN's medium variant projection became the baseline for everything, from climate models to pension fund planning. That projection, as of their 2024 revision, shows the world population growing until the mid-2080s, peaking at roughly 10.3 billion, and then beginning a very gradual decline. The core of this forecast rests on a key assumption about fertility. The UN forecasts that in country after country, especially those with alarmingly low birth rates today, fertility will stop falling and start to modestly recover. For instance, they forecast that South Korea's fertility rate, which has plummeted to a staggering 0.7 children per woman, will begin climbing back up as soon as 2026. Similarly, they see the United States rate stabilizing at its current level of about 1.6 for the rest of the century. This assumption creates a smooth, almost reassuring arc. But here's the first major crack in that story. An economist from the University of Pennsylvania, Jesus Fernandez Villaverde, and other analysts have been digging into the real-time data, and they're finding what looks like a systematic error. In countries like Colombia, Turkey, and Egypt, the UN's recent estimates for the number of births have been significantly higher, sometimes by huge margins, than the actual numbers later reported by national governments. The UN essentially adds a statistical correction, believing official counts miss births. But in nations classified as having reliable systems, this correction may be inflating the baseline. The implication is huge. If we're starting our projections from a population base that's already too high, the entire forecast is skewed. And if this is happening in major middle-income nations, the question becomes unavoidable. What about the single biggest piece of the puzzle, China? This is where my own analysis really begins. China is the linchpin. The UN forecasts that China will lose over 200 million people by 2054 and more than half its population by 2100, a staggering collapse. But even that dramatic forecast, a demographer from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, Yi Fujian and others argue, might be based on inflated numbers. He pointed out that in the year 2000, when you added up all the birth reports submitted by local governments across China, they totaled 17.7 million births. But the national census conducted that same year counted only 13.8 million infants under age 1. That is a 12% gap between what local officials reported and what the census could actually find. That is not a statistical margin of error. That is systematic inflation. In China, population data is collected by local governments before being sent to Beijing. Those local officials have an incredibly strong incentive to inflate their birth numbers. Why? Because more babies reported means more funding from the central government for schools, pension systems, poverty alleviation programs, and infrastructure. It means hitting targets that the central government has explicitly prioritized, especially since they reversed the one-child policy and started encouraging more births. What makes me even more concerned is that this incentive to inflate has only gotten stronger. When China introduced the two-child policy in 2016, the National Health and Family Planning Commission announced 17.86 million births, a 7.9% jump from the previous year. Some provinces reported absolutely incredible increases. Shandong claimed a 56% increase. Xinjiang claimed 75%. But here's what I find deeply suspicious. Vaccine registration data and school enrollment numbers showed no corresponding surge. If you actually had 8.7% more babies, you would see those infants show up in healthcare systems and early education programs within a year or two. The fact that those systems saw no such spike tells me that much of this reported baby boom was likely fabricated to make the policy look successful. And yet, when I examined the UN's methodology, I found no evidence that they adjust for this known distortion. The UN's population division treats China's official statistics as relatively reliable, perhaps with minor undercounting adjustments, but not as systematically inflated. That means the UN's baseline for 1/6 of humanity is probably tens of millions of people too high from the start, and that error compounds over generations in their projections. This isn't just about China. It points to a broader issue in how we forecast humanity itself. Major institutions like the UN have a monumental task. They must provide a stable, long-term planning baseline for governments and NGOs worldwide. Announcing that global population will peak in 2055 and then sharply decline could trigger economic panic and political upheaval. Is there an institutional, almost subconscious, bias toward a smoother, more distant, and less disruptive transition? I think it's a question worth asking. Their stated reasoning for assuming a fertility rebound is based on an observed pattern, that as societies adapt with better childcare and work-life balance, fertility can stabilize or slightly recover, as it did in some Nordic countries. But to assume this pattern will automatically apply everywhere and begin immediately feels to me less like rigorous demography and more like what one demographer from the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, IIASA, called a bit of wishful thinking. Now, before we dive deeper into what this accelerated timeline means for the global economy, I want to quickly talk about something that's been a genuine help in my own busy routine. Like a lot of you, I'm constantly juggling research, scripting, and trying to eat well without spending hours in the kitchen. That's why I started using Mom's Meals. They've been a real game changer for me. Mom's Meals delivers chef-prepared, ready-to-eat healthy meals right to your door. You just heat and eat. What really stands out is the range of options. They have meals designed for specific needs. Keto-friendly meals, diabetic-friendly, low-carb, low cholesterol, halal, vegetarian meals, and so much more. It's all about convenience without compromising on nutrition, which fits perfectly into a packed schedule. And it's surprisingly affordable, with prices starting from just $7.99 per meal. If you're looking to simplify your mealtime, I've put the link in the description. You can get 50% off your first order if you want to try it. It's helped me stay on track, and I think it could do the same for you. All right, let's get back to the analysis. If we accept the premise that the population peak is closer, perhaps 2055 instead of 2083, the economic and geopolitical implications aren't just accelerated, they are fundamentally reshuffled. First, let's talk about the first wave crisis zones. This includes Europe, Japan, and crucially, China. The McKinsey Global Institute describes these as economies facing an inversion of their age pyramid, from a broad base of youth to a top-heavy structure of elderly. Their analysis suggests that without massive gains in productivity or significant changes to work and retirement, GDP per capita growth in these regions could slow dramatically. A sooner peak means this pressure arrives not in the distant future, but within the career span of most people watching this video. China's case becomes even more acute. If its population decline is deeper and starts from a lower peak, its Japanification, economic stagnation under the weight of an aging society, may not be a gradual process, but a sudden compression. The demographic anchor on its growth becomes heavier, faster. Second, the window of opportunity nations. This is where the story gets more nuanced, and this is a key part of my takeaway. Countries like India are positioned to reap a demographic dividend. With a young population entering its prime working years, India has a potential engine for economic growth. A 2025 study in Humanities and Social Sciences Communications estimated this dividend could add about 1.9 percentage points to annual per capita income growth, but crucially, only if supported by strong policies in health, education, and job creation. My interpretation here is that a global population downturn actually increases the relative value of India's and later Africa's younger workforce. But this window is temporary. India's own working age share is expected to peak around 2030. A faster global demographic decline might make their current advantage more potent, but it doesn't lengthen their timeline. They have to get the policy right now. Third, the final growth frontier, Africa. Sub-Saharan Africa is the stark exception, with fertility rates still well above replacement level. The the UN forecasts Africa's population will rise from about 1.2 billion to 2.2 billion by 2054. However, even here, critics like demographer Hervé Lebras argue the UN may be overestimating how long high fertility will last, pointing to historically rapid declines in other regions. Whether the peak is 2083 or 2055, Africa's weight in the global population and eventually the global economy is set to rise dramatically. This is the most significant long-term geopolitical shift on the board. So what does all this mean? We are potentially looking at a century defined not by a population bomb, but by a population bottleneck. Economies built on perpetual growth in workers and consumers will have to adapt to a new reality. Retirement ages will almost certainly have to rise. The flow of immigration will become an even more critical and contentious economic lever for aging nations. The political power derived from a large population will gradually shift. Some argue this decline could ease environmental pressures. That's likely true in the very long run. But the transition, the next 50 to 80 years, will be economically fraught. We will be managing the care of an unprecedentedly large elderly cohort with a shrinking tax base. I think the probability that global population peaks before 2070 is more likely than not. I would put it at maybe 70% likelihood that we see peak humanity somewhere between 2055 and 2065, based on the fertility trends I am seeing and the systematic biases in official statistics. The UN's 2083 projection seems to me to be an upper bound scenario that assumes policy interventions and cultural shifts that have not materialized despite decades of low fertility. The counter-argument, of course, is that the UN has been broadly accurate before and that its models incorporate a vast array of data. They could be right. Fertility might find a floor we can't yet see, but when I look at the relentless downward trajectory in nations from South Korea to Colombia and the powerful social and economic forces driving it, women's education, economic cost, urbanization, the assumption of an imminent automatic rebound feels like the least likely scenario. We are living through one of the great inflection points in human history. Understanding its timing and shape isn't about fear, it's about foresight. If the UN is too optimistic by 2 or 3 decades, that means every long-term plan, based on their numbers, is built on quicksand. Pension systems that assume a certain ratio of workers to retirees will face crises much sooner. Government debt trajectories that depend on future taxpayer bases will hit walls faster. Economic growth models that assume steady labor force expansion will need radical revision. One thing I am less certain about is whether fertility will ever recover in the most advanced economies. The UN assumes it will because of policy adaptations, but I see deep structural barriers: housing affordability crises, student debt burdens, delayed partnership formation, and fundamental shifts in how younger generations think about work, family, and lifestyle. Those are not problems that get solved quickly. They may require generational changes that we have not yet begun to address. So my takeaway is this: we should be planning for a world where population decline starts sooner, happens faster, and goes further than the official forecasts suggest. That means rethinking pension systems now, not later. It means immigration policies need to be reformed before crises hit. It means economic growth models need to factor in permanent labor force shrinkage. And it means geopolitical strategies need to account for a world where demographic advantage shifts more rapidly than we thought. What do you think? Is the world ready for an earlier population peak? Do you agree that the UN is being too optimistic? Do you see different trends in your country? Let me know your perspective in the comments. If you found this deep dive valuable, please help the channel by liking the video, subscribing, and hitting the notification bell so you don't miss our next analysis. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.